Muy buenas noches, muy buenas tardes.
Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. Once again from Berlin, Germany, we begin broadcast number 287 of Demolishing Myths Talks. Thank you very much for joining us, and please remember to help us out with a thumbs up against censorship. Joining us again on the other side of the screen and the other side of the European continent, from Madrid, Spain, is our dear Juan Antonio Aguilar. Juan Antonio, how's everything over there?
Juan Antonio Aguilar, Juan Antonio, ¿qué tal todo por ahí?
Muy bien.
Very well. It's been raining non-stop here, but all good. I mean, it's a pleasure as always to be here.
Querido Juan Antonio, como tema
Dear Juan Antonio, as for the topic, first for today, I wanted us to present the Russian advances in Ukraine. Here are some images, and by the way, once again to the crew, if I seem a bit slow, it's because of the jet lag. I just got off the plane after an 18-hour flight, so my apologies. But let's start then with these images, Juan Antonio. By the way, they're from our friendly channel, our sister channel on Telegram, Wars and Geopolitics. Everyone is invited to subscribe to that channel. These are the images of Italian soldiers surrendering.
Estas las imágenes de soldados ucranianos rendidos en Pokrovsk, respetada su rendición,
In Pokrovsk, after their surrender was respected, they were taken as prisoners of war. Images released by the Russian armed forces show the soldiers. And here as well, just minutes ago, these are the first images of Russian soldiers in Pokrovsk, with vehicles, in this case, a pickup truck. Here are the first images of their entry, not only on foot anymore, of Russian soldiers into Pokrovsk, but now with vehicles, as a sign of Russia's increasingly consolidated advance. What's your analysis, Juan Antonio, of the current situation in Pokrovsk, in Minograd, in Kupiansk, and so on?
en Minograd, en Kupiansk, etc.
Bueno, lo primero llamar la atención.
Well, the first thing is to draw attention to something that one keeps noticing in the Western media. They're starting to say and acknowledge logically the evidence that Pokrovsk has fallen, practically fallen. The Russian Minister of Defense hasn't announced it yet because in the north of Pokrovsk there are still a few streets, a few buildings where there may still be Ukrainian soldiers hiding, and therefore cleanup operations are underway, so to speak. In fact, one has to be glad to see those images of the prisoners, because these Ukrainians have saved their lives, since what was happening there was turning into a real tragedy. So, as I was saying, Western media keep insisting on aspects of the war that they seem to have a hard time understanding. In other words, they still don't quite grasp what this is about. Let's see. Some Western outlets say Russia is about to achieve its greatest success, or its only major success in 2 years. Why? Because clearly they haven't understood anything. They haven't understood a thing. Obviously, there's a Russian advance along the entire front. Kupiansk is considered lost, 95% already taken by the Russian army. Kupiansk is a city farther north, along the entire Donbass defense line. Volchansk is also considered lost, about 85% already in Russian hands. Volchansk is the gateway to Kharkiv. Fighting is already taking place inside Konstantinovka. That's the road leading to Kramatorsk. And the entire Pokrovsk-Minograd enclave is considered lost, which consists of 2 cities that are right next to each other, with mines, industries, and so on. And, well, the images they've shown indicate that Russian units have been inside for some time now, but only a few small pockets remain to the north of the city, as I said. The encirclement has been in the operational phase for days. A complete encirclement is about to happen. There's less than a kilometer left through which Ukrainian soldiers can still get out on foot, at night, hiding, and so on, while facing the danger of artillery or drone attacks, trying to escape the encirclement. They've been without logistics for days. Nothing is getting in. All attempts to break the encirclement have failed. There, roughly encircled, or at least they were, we don't know what the real situation is, there were about 9 Ukrainian brigades, plus the territorial battalions and others, which could total between 5,000 and 10,000 troops. We know that, with 6,500 casualties at this point, we can no longer even be sure how many people remain operational or capable of fighting in that area. And when I say that these Western media outlets don't get it, it's because the issue isn't so much about occupying, which in the end will fall, just as Kupiansk will fall, just as Volchansk will fall, and so on, but about realizing that they're still trying to break that encirclement, and therefore Zelensky keeps sending more reserve forces there. But of course he's now practically sending reserve forces that he's pulling from other parts of the front, weakening those points along the line of contact.
Here's yesterday's France 24 cover, Juan Antonio. This analyst and the headline, "The war in Ukraine is at a stalemate due to the slowness of European aid and the reluctance of the United States."
Stalemate. If they consider it a stalemate because they keep sending Ukrainian units there, it's because those units have been destroyed and they have nothing left to send. This is truly mind-blowing. So mind-blowing that it has caused a clash between Syrsky, chief of the general staff of the Ukrainian army, and Zelensky himself, because the order to withdraw wasn't given when it should have been, because Zelensky now lives in another reality. Or indeed, he has such a criminal inclination that he no longer cares about the lives of his troops and has given the order to hold out to the end. Well, Pokrovsk is starting to sound like Stalingrad. What are they going to do? Keep up a useless resistance and not save the troops? Well, that's exactly what they've done. Instead of saving those very valuable units because they were veteran units, and then the battalions of people they round up on the streets and send to the front, throwing all possible reserves there and weakening the rest of the front. This is absurd. From a military point of view, it's absurd. It makes no sense. The logical thing would have been to save those units and withdraw them to a defensive area, to a defensive line that could be held. But no, we keep getting bogged down because Zelensky doesn't want to deliver bad news. And time and again, as has happened since the assault on Bakhmut began, we're talking about more than a year ago now, they fall into the same trap, trying to hold positions that the Russians leave and allow Ukrainian units to keep being sent there. What for? To keep destroying them in an endless war of attrition. And it seems that Western analysts don't see this, at least not those in the media. They don't want to see it. They talk about a stalemate. Let's see. It's a stalemate if you maintain your combat capability. But if every day you're getting weaker because you're burning through more units, where you have to admit that mobilization isn't working, and that the number of deserters is also increasing exponentially, there are estimates of about 200 to 250,000 so far this year, with around 29,000 just last month. Well, that shows that everything is falling apart. Tell me, I don't know. I mean, how long can you hold out? 1 more month? 2 more months? Maybe 5 more months? 8 more months? And then what? Then what? You're exhausting everything. All your ability to keep fighting is fading away. If you add to that not just the deserters, but also the absolute lack of tactical medicine, which is causing a large number of amputations among the wounded, and therefore these are people who won't be able to fight again. And if you add that so far this year, arms shipments from the European Union and NATO have dropped by more than 47%. You're facing shortages in everything. Absolutely everything.
Tienes deficiencia en todo, en todo. Y lo que es más grave, una vez que...
And what's even more serious, once Avdiivka, Makivka, all of that falls, what's going to be next? What will happen afterward? Possibly, and from here on this is speculation, because logically I don't have access to the Russian General Staff's operational plans. What they'll do is try to straighten the front line, meaning they'll somehow work to secure all those new positions, those cities that are falling, and then launch another new offensive.
Y después se lanzará otra nueva ofensiva. Esa nueva ofensiva puede tomar dos direcciones.
That new offensive could take two directions. Trying to reach the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk line from behind, which would be the last line of defense in the Donbass, or continuing toward Dnipro, already in a steppe area where no defenses have been built. Therefore, it would be very difficult for an increasingly exhausted Ukrainian army to withstand those offensives. Without built fortifications, without natural defensive lines, without major elevated positions. In other words, logically that would mean they would collapse above the southern front in Zaporizhia. As a result, that front would fall, it would collapse. And what will stop the Russian army before the Dnipro? We don't know. We don't know which of these two options the Russian General Staff might take, but clearly the situation is becoming more delicate, as we had already predicted months ago. This is something that's been seen coming. It's no surprise, nothing strange. I mean, anyone with a minimum understanding of operational art can see it. That's why I find it increasingly odd the way Western media analyze things. They say, well, stalemate. No, these are small advances. Yes, small advances. But who said the goal here was territorial? The goal is to destroy the enemy's combat capability. And therefore, every time there's one of these battles, like Bakhmut, like Uzhna, like Kursk, and now in that whole cauldron set up around Pokrovsk and Mirnorod, each time that happens, it's Ukrainian units being burned out with no second line of defense left to hold, right? That is to say, well, this is the situation. Of course, as always, the question we're usually asked is, so then, when will the possible collapse of the front occur? We don't know. A month, 5 months, 9 months, we don't know. Now, ask yourselves a very simple question. Does the Ukrainian army right now, along the front line, across the entire line of contact, have more strength than it did months ago, or is it weaker? If the answer is the latter, then make the projection. In 4 or 5 months, it will be even weaker. And in the end, there's a breaking point. Inevitably, there will be a breaking point.
Juan Antonio,
Juan Antonio, 2 or 3 questions about the situation. You just presented 2 possible scenarios. Once Pokrovsk is taken, once Kupiansk is taken, even farther north, exactly in Bolshansk. On one hand, the possibility of perhaps the most, how to call it, doctrinal, in the sense of the most logical, because so far Russia has already determined the destruction of the major defensive points of the Ukrainian front. Only Sloviansk and Kramatorsk would remain. That's one of the possible scenarios you just mentioned, the one you referred to.
Yo creo que en principio, Ezequiel, sería el más lógico. ¿Por qué?
I think that, in principle, Ezekiel, it would be the most logical thing. Why? Because of what I'm saying about the general tendency to align the front. If you notice, the last defensive line, which is the one in Konstantinovka, where the Russian army has already entered, along with Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, creates a sort of depression that can be seen on the map. The logical thing would be to align that depression, That front, precisely, would also mean the end of the last defensive line in the Donbass, which would also fulfill a political military objective, the liberation of all of Donbass. That is, practically all of Luhansk is under control. Only that part of the Donetsk People's Republic would remain, which would then fall. And above all, the fortifications built there since 2014 would fall. Let's remember that's when the war began.
Recordemos que es cuando comienza la guerra. No se dejen llevar por las mentiras de la prensa occidental.
Don't be swayed by the lies of the Western press. The war began in 2014, and that's why those fortifications are there, built since then. So, once that falls, besides, it's a very rich industrial area that is of great strategic interest to Russia. Once that area is aligned, meaning once it has reached this point, the interesting thing is to straighten that front line, and therefore one tends to think that this will be the next move.
Uno tiende a pensar que ese va a ser el siguiente movimiento. Lo que pasa es que no va a ser asaltada de este.
What's happening is that it's not going to be assaulted from east to west, but rather the offensive will likely come from the south and the north, encircling, as has been done elsewhere, that whole Sloviansk-Kramatorsk line. Right? That's why they were moving toward Lyman and Sviatohirsk, to take them after the fall of Kupiansk. And from the south, that is, up to the Konstantinivka area, that depression would remain, that line they have there, Sloviansk-Kramatorsk. And with that, let's say the political goal of the complete liberation of Donbass would be achieved. But there's another possibility, which I imagine is the one you were about to point out.
Que me imagino que es la que ibas a señalar.
Exactamente. En profundidad hacia,
Exactly. In depth toward Dnipro and Zaporizhia, taking advantage of the enormous and unexpected advances of recent weeks, in fact, of recent months, in this area, in territories that are practically unfortified, or at least with minimal defenses.
No fortificados, por lo menos, ¿sí? O con defensas.
No, but not only the fortified ones. There are no natural defenses either. There are no high elevations, no rivers that would cause major problems when trying to cross them, or anything like that. In other words, there aren't many forested areas either. It's mostly steppes.
All right, now two questions between these two alternatives. The first one. Could Russia also launch an offensive in the north, in the area located here between Bolchansk and the northern part of Kupiansk? Considering that this entire area appears practically empty, unfortunately, we don't have the other map showing the current troop positions because we lack a connection. But this area seems practically empty, not only due to the decision not to station troops there, but also because of the absence of cities or population centers. Here too, Russia could carry out a bite much more easily than elsewhere, without much strategic sense, but with the possibility of very large territorial gains, albeit with an obviously media-oriented objective. That's the first question, whether there's a possibility there, or if it's just a very Western way of conceiving war. And that's the first question. The second question, Juan Antonio, could Russia do something in between, something hybrid? Not a direct attack on Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, nor an attack toward Dnipro with Pavlograd as an intermediate objective, but rather create something in between. Juan Antonio, like an incursion between this axis and the Dnipro axis, in order to generate chaos. On one hand, an advance toward an undefended area, and on the other, an attack on Sloviansk and Kramatorsk from the rear. Would such madness be possible?
Desde la retaguardia, ¿posible una locura así o
no, a ver, yo creo que cuando he dicho la más probable es
No, look, I think that when I said the most likely move is toward the Sloviansk and Kramatorsk line, it's by making that maneuver. I don't think it's going to be assaulted from east to west. In other words, it's going to be encircled. Exactly, it would be an encirclement maneuver. That is, if you manage to encircle there, it will indeed take months. It will take months. But it will wear them down much more than you think. Then, once the exhaustion is greater, who's going to stop a deep offensive toward Dnipro, and as you rightly say, north toward Kharkiv?
Claro, ¿qué capacidad habrá luego ya de defender zonas que no están
Of course,
fortificadas?
what capacity will there be later to defend areas that aren't fortified, that don't have, let's say, natural lines that allow for stronger
Que
defense?
permitan una defensa mayor.
As I said, heights, rivers, swamps, or things like that.
Claro, es decir,
I mean, sure, but why attack, for example, that northern area if it's going to fall on its own? The moment they have to divert more units to defend other points along the front, that area, which as you rightly say is practically empty, will fall on its own. And since the objective, which they still don't seem to understand, is not to gain more square kilometers every day, but to destroy more units each day, when the Ukrainian forces are much more exhausted, how will they defend those areas?
estén ya mucho más agotadas, ¿cómo van a defender esas zonas? ¿Con qué? Y entonces, ¿quién va a parar
With what?
en esas zonas?
And then who's going to stop the Russian army in those areas?
Los puntos críticos aquí son
I think the critical points here are that encirclement movement of the last truly defensive line in the Donbass, the one we mentioned, and an offensive toward Dnipro, because it cuts, keep in mind that it cuts the front, meaning it divides the Ukrainian territory east of the Dnipro River into two parts. On a smaller scale, it's a bit like the map. If you launch an offensive toward Dnipro, what do you cut off? You cut off the entire northern part from the southern part. So what does that cause? Well, Zaporizhia could fall, or the northern part could fall.
Puede caer Zaporozhia, o puede caer la parte norte. Pero tú la concentras, claro, es decir, es que
Of course, I mean, that would be the opposite version of the famous Ukrainian attempt during the 2023 offensive to push into Russian territory. There are two, them reaching Mariupol, and now the Russians already reaching Dnipro. What will be the decision of the Russian General Staff? Well, I don't know, because here the political factor comes into play. The political factor of being able to say we have already liberated all of Donbass. So, I think, well, I have no doubt that they will try to align the front and finish off that defensive line, which is very well established, because it's an agglomeration of cities.
Está muy bien montada, porque es una aglomeración de ciudades. Konstantinovka, Kramatorsk, Slaviansk y Zium.
Konstantinovka, Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, and Izium. Of course, it's a very well-established line since 2014, and I think that will be the main objective. But obviously, at a given moment, you could launch a deep offensive to cut Ukrainian territory east of the Dnipro in two, making everything much more difficult, almost impossible to defend, especially with the limited forces the Kiev regime has left. We'll see how those growing divisions within the Ukrainian General Staff itself, and between the General Staff and Zelensky's own government, turn out. We'll see. To this, you always have to add the population's war fatigue. The fact that there's been talk of having to evacuate the cities because it won't be possible to endure the winter.
Tengan que evacuar las ciudades porque no se va a poder sostener el invierno. Imaginar una Kiev con varios millones de habitantes.
Imagine a Kiev with several million inhabitants, without heating and with many hours of the day without light. That is, without electric light. In other words, in the end it might be more feasible even to avoid a population collapse, in the sense that there could be a social uprising to begin the evacuation. In fact, trains are no longer running towards Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. The population has already been practically evacuated from that entire area. And when that happens, it's because you indeed foresee that you're going to lose it. And when some of these cities are starting to tell the population that maybe it's better to go to the countryside if they have relatives or further west and so on, it's because you won't be able to hold it. It's just impossible. It's impossible. With 72% of the electrical infrastructure already destroyed, it's impossible to sustain people in the cities. Yes, those who have managed to get a diesel generator might be able to hold out longer, but it's getting harder and harder. This is the concept of an industrial war of attrition and prolongation, which seems to be something that here they don't. And when they say no, it's at a stalemate. No, I mean, come on. The Russians have only managed to liberate 5,000 square kilometers so far this year. A trifle, right? Well, yes, of course. I mean, if you think about the great offensives, Operation Bagration in World War II in 1944, yes, of course, indeed, those were small advances. That was a terrible, deep operation. It was already after 3 years of war and with millions of troops ready to be deployed. It's not the same situation. Beyond the changes that have taken place in modern warfare, especially because of drones. If it weren't for drones, there would probably be larger, deep operations right now. But of course, you can't risk having a high level of casualties and equipment destruction.
What's your interpretation of this, Juan Antonio? These are the images, a small portion of the footage initially released by a British journalist, evidently in coordination with the GUR, the Ukrainian military intelligence, of the liberation, counteroffensive, rescue operation carried out in Pokrovsk a few days ago with 15 elite GUR soldiers, commanded by Budanov from Pavlograd, if I remember correctly, using Black Hawk helicopters, which until now had never been seen in Ukrainian hands. The soldiers, at best, out of those 11 or 15, advanced about 200 meters before, between drones and conventional artillery. Well, within minutes, all of them were eliminated. And on top of that, there was a huge media impact because of how spectacular the footage of their arrival and destruction was. What was that commando operation responding to, with no apparent sense of military prudence? Juan Antonio?
I think it was simply a purely propagandistic move. The intention was to carry out a very Hollywood-style operation. 2 helicopters arrive behind enemy lines, Special Forces commandos land, carry out some kind of action, and then take a photo raising the flag in some significant place so that the next day they make the front pages of newspapers and lead the evening news. In other words, to give the impression, especially to Ukrainian public opinion, that all is not lost, that special operations with commandos and so on are being carried out. The thing is, conceiving war through the lens of Hollywood movies is a sure path to disaster. Let's even suppose they hadn't been intercepted or hadn't ended up the way they did. By the way, one of the 2 helicopters was destroyed. Let's suppose the operation had actually been successful, that they had landed, carried out some quick strike, taken a few photos, raised a flag somewhere. Look what a great operation we've carried out. Fine, very good, you've achieved media success, the front page, the headlines. But in terms of the military campaign, what difference does that make? None. None at all. The thing is, Zelensky and his crew have spent 3 years living off taking pictures. Photos in Kursk, photos in the city. Well, he was in Kupiansk recently, photos there, and you think this isn't... Look, this isn't how you win a war. That works for you, well, for, I don't know, for what? To fool the Europeans? To say, no, look, it's still possible to do something, look, and keep them sending money. To fool Trump? Let's see, I don't get it, because I want to believe that the military intelligence, both from NATO and from the United States itself, is fully aware of the real situation on the battlefield. Therefore, this kind of operation can only have one goal, to deceive the population itself, to keep it under the illusory hope that we still have a chance of winning the war against Russia. Nothing else. It really doesn't have any other purpose. I can't give it any other purpose apart from taking down a helicopter. And the fact that some 15 soldiers, supposedly from special operations and therefore elite troops, died or were injured, I don't know, in that situation. That's your success. I find it incomprehensible. Absolutely incomprehensible. Well, yes, we know that in hybrid warfare, a very important part is the information war, trying somehow to create the impression that you're winning. Of course, it's been 3 years and a bit, 3.5 years, during which Ukraine has been winning the war. The thing is, damn, you remember shows we did years ago about what? Years ago, when we used to say, yeah, we're going from victory to victory until the final defeat, right? And it keeps coming true. It keeps coming true. Well, fine. Let's keep it up. The war is at a stalemate. The Russians have already suffered 5 million casualties. They've run out of missiles. The washing machine jokes are now carried by donkey. They've pulled the only armored vehicle out of the museums and are fighting with shovels. Well, if that's what they want the Western public to believe, then fine. Go ahead. Let's keep it up until the next defeat, right? Well, that's it then. The next victory. Sorry, the next victory. And well, that's that. Any day now they'll arrive, see the Russians taking pictures on the banks of the Dnipro and say, we're still winning, right? Well, fine, we're still winning. All of this deep down is ridiculous. I'd even say it's laughable, if it weren't at the expense of thousands and thousands of Ukrainians. That's the problem, that it's at the expense of thousands and thousands of Ukrainians, at the expense of the Ukrainian people themselves, who are the ones suffering the most from this. So that a bunch of hotheads like Kallas or von der Leyen or that clown Rutte can strut around at the cost of Ukrainian blood. Enough is enough. I mean, this can't go on. And well, it has to be said, every time some hack, some scribbler from the Western media says that the front is at a stalemate, that Russian casualties are incalculable, every time that kind of narrative is pushed, it's done at the expense of Ukrainian blood, at the expense of the suffering of the Ukrainian people. That's the reality. And they'll call us pro-Russian, Kremlin agents, and whatever else they want, just for saying that this is being done at the expense of the Ukrainian people, at the expense of Ukrainian soldiers sacrificed on NATO's bloody altar. By the way, there's some kind of group, I don't even know what to call them, of free Russians in Spain who report us for saying things against NATO. I defecate on NATO. Let's be perfectly clear about that.
Yo me defeco en la OTAN. A ver si lo entendemos claramente. Quiero su destrucción.
I want its destruction. Go ahead. Let them report me if they want. Let them report me. I want its destruction, precisely for a matter of Spanish national security, for Spain's national security, all right? NATO is a danger to Spain's national security, a danger, because it also puts us in the crosshairs of a possible nuclear attack if everything goes out of control. So, let the free Russians understand that perfectly well. And if they don't like it, there's a very simple way out. They can head to the border and get out of here, go shout and say their nonsense in another European country. But not in Spain, and even less to threaten Spaniards. That's that. We all know each other here. So, well, that's the situation.
Con lo cual, bueno, pues, esta es la situación. Al frente, pues, nada.
So nothing up front. You probably don't have any information about this award. This will likely lead to a change in your position. Here, the publication Süddeutsche Zeitung, the 2026 Westphalian Peace Prize is being awarded to NATO. It's a prize given every year here in Germany by a group of notable figures to the person or entity considered most significant for peace during the year. After the Nobel Peace Prize went to Corina Machado, who, 2 days later, called for a military attack on Venezuela. The Nobel Peace Prize has previously been awarded to prominent politicians who have made important contributions to peace in Europe. Now, the jury has selected the Transatlantic Military Alliance. If I remember correctly, among the electors are Merz here, Özdemir, the leader of the Greens and ex-husband of Pia Castro, the head of the House of Hohenzollern, one of the last aristocrats here, the CEO, the manager of Miele, a German company, and Jens Weizmann, the president of Deutsche Bank.
The usual suspects, yes, it's clear. Man, I hope that these people are capable of taking the Peace Prize away from Trump next year, huh? I think NATO, yes, because in the end, who deserves it more than NATO after 20 years of invading Afghanistan? Who deserves the Nobel Peace Prize more than NATO? Hey, 20 years of invading Afghanistan. And we can remember Libya or Yugoslavia, which is in Europe, because you still have to hear, as if they thought we were all idiots. You have to hear that the conflict in Ukraine is the first conflict to happen after the Cold War.
El primer conflicto ocurrido tras la Guerra Fría. No. Aquí hay que recordar la
No. Here we have to remember the disintegration of Yugoslavia and NATO's war crimes against Serbia. NATO's war crimes. Man, how could they not give it the Westphalian Peace Prize? But really, is there anything more criminal than NATO to not give it that Peace Prize? There isn't in Europe, that's the truth. It's fully deserved. Awards of this kind, just like the Oscars, are part of the same technology of disinformation and manipulation of reality. The falsification of reality is carried out with this kind of instrument.
La falsificación de la realidad se hace con este tipo de instrumentos. Los Oscars, Eurovisión, los premios Nobel.
The Oscars, Eurovision, the Nobel Prizes, the Sakharov Prize given by the European Union, all of this, who gets it? They give it to each other. I mean, let's not be ridiculous. It has a political function. To legitimize a narrative, the one the media transmits daily so that you believe it and get confused. That prize isn't worth a damn. I won't say the crude thing I really think about that prize. In other words, it's worthless, man. But then you say, oh, they gave the Peace Prize to NATO. Well, of course. Could there be anything that fights harder for peace than NATO? In Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, in other countries.
The peace of cemeteries, the Kantian peace of cemeteries.
Of course, the peace of the cemeteries. They deserve it, man. I just don't know. I don't know. Give them the Nobel Prize in Physics and the Planeta Prize in Literature, all to NATO. What's that worth? Nothing. No value at all. Nothing. Nothing.
Here, real quick, the words.
Venezuela into its satellite, operating from the heart of the Americas.
María Corina Machado hace unos días en una entrevista, Irán convirtió.
Maria Corina Machado said a few days ago in an interview that Iran turned Venezuela into a satellite.
In drone systems, they're building drones.
They are building drones and delivering technology. They are manufacturing drones in Venezuela for Iran.
Drones in our country, and they have used.
Well, they've been using our finances to launder assets and money for Hezbollah. They gave away 10,000 Venezuelan passports so that Iranians and Hezbollah members could move around the world.
By air away from Florida. In the case
And this is only 3 hours away from Florida. Well, this was at a business forum. In another one, he was calling for military intervention. I also remember one involving not only Hezbollah and Iran, but also Hamas. At any moment, they'll throw in the IRA from Ireland. Anything goes now.
Just to be clear, let's make it clear. First, Ezekiel is doing this to piss me off. He brings out this character straight out of the Munster family to piss me off. Hey, if you look closely, there's a certain resemblance. Some features are similar, even the hairstyle. Yes, meaning Iran is the one controlling Venezuela. They've sent Hezbollah and Hamas forces there. In fact, Hamas isn't fighting in the Strip. It's in Venezuela. And of course, the conclusion is obvious. The cartel of the Suns is being directed from Tehran. Since Iran is nothing more than a vassal piece of Beijing and Moscow, the whole scheme is connected. Well, this is the Nobel Peace Prize winner. This is the Nobel Peace Prize winner. I don't think she's ever told the truth in her life, not even when saying her own name. I even doubt that's her real name, probably another lie. But anyway, that's what all these awards and honors given to certain people are like. They're simply rewarded because they serve the interests of the oligarchy, nothing more. They have no other merit. And within the Venezuelan opposition, those who are sincere and honest know perfectly well the role that people like Leopoldo Lopez, Julio Borges, Maria Corina Machado, and others who are now hiding in Miami or New York have played. The ones buying luxury apartments in the most exclusive neighborhoods of Madrid. Because they brought money from there. Because they stole it. Anyone can be very critical of the Venezuelan government and talk about Hezbollah, Hamas, and as Ezequiel said, the IRA, the Banda del Impastre, the clown firefighter, and all that. You can think whatever you want, but what is clear is the moral and political character of this entire Venezuelan opposition. Whenever you want, we can talk about it.
Bien, para redondear el tema anterior, quería presentar...
Well, to wrap up the previous topic, I wanted to show a rather curious video. In fact, with the Terminator music playing in the background. Well, we can't play much more of the music. It's a Russian soldier resisting 7 drones. Not one, which would already be quite something. 7 drones held off by this man. Incredibly, well, a lot of courage, a lot of guts, and a lot of luck too, because he's going to walk away from the place after 7 attacks, Juan Antonio. 2 at a time. No idea how he actually managed it. With a little tree, unarmed. There he apparently appears to be down. A moment later, this man, standing up once again and taking more attacks, is going to walk away from the place. Pay attention. A bit of music again.
Music from Terminator.
There's one fluttering around over there, like snooping. And here's the same man again, standing there a while later. There he picked up a stick. Well, again another drone, and nothing. The image gets a bit lost because of the wind. Again, and.
Yes, 7 times. Crazy. Well, we should have him handle the Christmas lottery this year. Yes, really, really. No, but what's actually significant in the footage, joking aside, is the complexity of the current modern battlefield. I mean, of course, these drones aren't exactly expensive. They're basically quadcopters sold commercially, and they can carry a payload, maybe a kilo or just a grenade. But when you fill the battlefield with this kind of vehicle, it prevents you from concentrating your units too much. You have to keep them as spread out as possible, because if a drone goes down, well, at least the loss is 1, not 5. And it also shows that within military units, there's now a specialty that has become essential. Drone pilots. That is to say, those who are manipulating that whole swarm that constantly flies over the soldiers' heads. How long is this going to last? In military history, in the end, the shield has always emerged in response to the sword. I have no doubt that at some point, some kind of electronic warfare or interception system against drones will appear that will render them useless. Until, of course, there's a new development in drones that manages to block that electronic warfare or interception system. That's how it will be. But this is, as I said, the story of warfare since the days of the sword and the shield. It has always been that way. If the shield held, then you brought the mace, and then what you did was make a stronger shield. This isn't any secret, but the truth is that right now, on a battlefield, the sky is full of these little gadgets. And well, this soldier was incredibly lucky. If even one of them had hit him, maybe he would have survived, but they would have had to go rescue him. Let's see what the wounds would be like. He probably wouldn't be able to fight again if he didn't die, right? This shows us that when people say no, it's just that the army's advance is very slow. Of course, it's because in World War I and World War II, in the war and invasion of Iraq, this didn't exist. This wasn't in the skies, above the heads of each of the soldiers. So we have to understand that by 2025, the battlefield has turned into this. And therefore, that largely determines the possibilities for deep advances. Beyond that, more than advancing in depth, What interests me is exposing the enemy's units and destroying them. Advance a little, they try to stop me with new units, I destroy them again, advance a bit more, and in this way I wear down the enemy. But even if one wanted to carry out a deep operation, this is what you have in the skies. And this is a very clear change in the configuration of the battlefield, and doctrine must be developed for it. This isn't just about saying, well, if there are 2,000 drones, I'll send 5,000 soldiers forward and, well, some will make it, right? Of course, that already puts us in the trench assaults of World War I. That's not what this is about. You have to minimize the number of casualties, because in a prolonged war, that's essential in order to endure, to be able to hold out. And that's what isn't understood in NATO's military doctrine, and therefore, in the measures taken by the Ukrainian General Staff in Kiev when facing the situation. They burn through units and burn through units. And they don't realize that the war has already been going on for 3.5 years or more. But why wouldn't it last 4.5 years? Well, it'll last 5 years. How are you going to hold out?
Juan Antonio, como próximo tema,
Juan Antonio, for the next topic, what would you like? The issue of nuclear tests, Trump's statements, Putin's response, the Minuteman III tests in the United States? Or should we also go toward Venezuela, the troop buildup, and the possibility of a direct attack? Whatever you prefer.
Well, since we've started with the military topic, I think we can continue with the issue of nuclear matters, among other things, because, did someone bring it up first?
As a trigger.
Wait. A word about the Venezuela issue. Simply that the situation remains the same as it was a week ago, 2 weeks ago, and 3 weeks ago. They keep attacking boats whose origin we don't know. They could be fishermen, tobacco smugglers, drug traffickers, or anything else, even illegal immigrants. We just don't know. One thing is what the Pentagon says, and another is reality. We don't know what the reality is. They've attacked boats leaving Venezuela, boats leaving Colombia, boats in the Atlantic, boats in the Pacific. That is to say, I still don't see any possibility that a ground invasion is about to begin. I mean, there's not going to be a Normandy landing, because there isn't enough buildup of force for that. So I get the feeling this is going to stay as it is, and there will be more opportunities to talk about it as the possible courses of action become clearer. I mean, we can touch a bit on the issue of nuclear matters, which I think are more dangerous and more important. And so, well, it's just one more step in the same scenario, the same theater of operations as the issue we've been discussing about Ukraine.
Here are Trump's words from yesterday, if I remember correctly. We renamed the Department of Defense as the Department of War. And applause. They changed it to the Department of Defense after World War II. Now we've brought it back, the war thing. We won World War I, we won World War II. We won all the wars before and all the wars between the two world wars. We never lost a war. Simply, sometimes we don't fight to win, but even so, we always win. Sometimes we pick a country, stay there for 15 years, bomb it to the core, and make everyone miserable.
Nobody knows why we're there, you know.
No one knows why we're there, but we made it clear that the days of political correctness in our military forces are over.
The strongest military by far in the world. We make the best equipment, the best.
Tenemos las fuerzas armadas más fuertes del mundo, reconstruí nuestra...
We have the strongest armed forces in the world. I rebuilt our military. We have the best equipment, the best soldiers. We rebuilt our nuclear triad. We are the #1 nuclear power in the world, which I hate to say because it's terrible. Russia is second, China third, quite a bit behind, but they're going to catch up in 4 or 5 years.
distancia, pero nos van a alcanzar en 4 o 5
Years
años.
they want to catch us, and they'll be able to catch us, and we're maybe working on a
And we're working on a plan to denuclearize. We'll see if it works.
we have the strongest military anywhere in the world by far.
Tenemos las fuerzas armadas más fuertes.
We have the strongest armed forces in the world. Well, this was said immediately after the sudden announcement of the resumption of direct nuclear testing, the last of which was carried out by the United States in 1992. In 1993, there was a treaty that prohibited this between Russia and the United States. And by the way, all of this was in response to what Trump called nuclear tests. The term nuclear reactor surely came up in the tests of the Bistoletti missile and the Poseidon torpedo, and that's how he reacted. But anyway, this prompted Russia's response, a meeting of the Security Council. Oh, and then, the test of the Minuteman III missile without a nuclear warhead. Exactly, without a nuclear warhead, but it was carried out. That's more or less to be expected, since they conduct such tests from time to time. But it's a difficult moment. What's your take on this whole situation, Juan Antonio?
Vamos. Primero, cualquiera que intenta analizar la situación.
Come on. First of all, anyone who tries to analyze the situation based on Trump's statements runs the risk of having a stroke or not understanding anything. In other words, of entering a state of mental confusion, because it's impossible. He's a character who says they won all the wars before and after, World War I, World War II, and the ones after World War II. Then he starts saying that they're the world's leading nuclear power, which isn't true. But he says it, and he also says that this is very bad and that therefore we need to see if we can start a denuclearization process, something that actually began many years ago, right? The Nuclear Test Ban Treaty is an example of that. And now he skips it. One more of the international arms limitation treaties, another one that this man ignores. So in the middle of all that jargon he uses, it's impossible to tell whether he's glorifying war or wants to move toward denuclearization and peace. In other words, it's not really clear because he mixes everything together. One starts to wonder if this man is in his right mind. Therefore, it's impossible to carry out any kind of analysis, not even a superficial one, based on Mr. Trump's statements. It's nonsense, an absurd ramble. It's going in circles over things in which he contradicts himself within the same speech. He contradicts himself. Which means it's impossible to do any analysis. So let's get to the facts. First, a clarification, because I've noticed that many people, especially those close to Trump, try to justify it by saying, well, the United States is going to conduct nuclear tests. Of course, Russia, look, has tested the Bistoletti missile, which is a nuclear missile. Let's be clear. The Bistoletti is as much a nuclear missile as the Minuteman, to name one. And these are tests of the missile, of the rocket, to make sure it works. A nuclear test is detonating an atomic bomb in the atmosphere, on the surface, or underground, with all the resulting effects that entails.
Con los consiguientes efectos que eso tiene. No tiene nada que ver. Que yo pruebe un misil.
It has nothing to do with me testing a missile that could have carried a nuclear weapon at some point and actually detonating a nuclear weapon. Anyone who doesn't understand this just needs to read and study. It's that simple. I'm very sorry, but as I've seen in comments about some of my recent statements, let's be clear. I'm sorry. But it's simply a matter of lack of knowledge, of ignorance. A nuclear test means detonating an atomic weapon. And that has consequences. And they know it perfectly well in some Pacific archipelagos where the American nuclear tests were carried out, for example at Bikini Atoll. The consequences are well known. There was a treaty banning this type of weapon.
Bien, había un tratado de prohibición de este tipo de armas. El señor Trump, él por su cuenta, de forma unilateral.
Mr. Trump, on his own, unilaterally skips it. That is, the United States once again is going to violate another treaty, like the Strategic Arms Treaty, the Intermediate Range Weapons Treaty, the Conventional Arms Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty. The ABM Treaty is just another one, because the supposed threats are Russia, China, and North Korea. But here, the ones breaking the treaties to restart a new arms race are the United States, and by extension, the group of vassals and lackeys that follow them. Fine. Logically, if the United States withdraws from the treaty, that's equivalent to telling its adversaries that they are free to carry out whatever nuclear tests they deem appropriate. Let's talk about Russia, China, and maybe others. Let's see, this is simply a political issue. And why? Because it's not necessary at this point, with the computer models that supercomputers make possible, to carry out nuclear tests by detonating atomic bombs. It's not necessary. Since the last ones were conducted in the early 1990s, 35 years have passed during which atomic weapons have continued to be developed without the need to detonate any. So, why is Trump doing it? Well, maybe as a message for domestic consumption, that could be, but it's clear he's doing it in response to what? To the fact that Russia has tested two weapons that represent a game changer. The Borovesnik missile, which carries a nuclear reactor for propulsion, right?
Lleva un reactor nuclear para impulsarse. No ha hecho ninguna prueba nuclear, no ha detonado ninguna bomba atómica.
He hasn't carried out any nuclear tests, he hasn't detonated any atomic bombs, and the Poseidon torpedo. And someone will say, of course he's testing weapons. Of course he's testing weapons, right? The United States has already tested the Dark Eagle, which they claim is a hypersonic weapon. Let's see if it really is hypersonic, but at least it's supersonic and can carry a nuclear warhead. They're testing the AGM-181 missile from the RSO, which is a cruise missile to be launched from strategic bombers, and it can also carry a nuclear warhead. And they're testing a modernization of the Minuteman III as an intercontinental ballistic missile, which also carries MIRV nuclear warheads. And why is that? Well, because it has to be said, no matter how much bluster Trump puts out, the American nuclear triad is outdated. That doesn't mean it's not operational. The missiles can launch, but it's outdated. That is, especially the part with the silos, the intercontinental ballistic missiles. I mean, well, the strategic aviation, aside from that half dozen or so B-2s and a few B-1s, the truth is that most of them are B-52s, already old but still useful. We're talking about a plane like the Tupolev 95, a plane from the 1950s. So of course that needs modernization. Its missiles too, the intercontinental missiles as well.
Los misiles intercontinentales también. Los silos también, que algunos están oxidados.
The silos, too. Some are rusted. There's even doubt about whether the hatch can be opened to launch the missile. That's how far things have gone. Maybe what's actually more modernized in the U.S. nuclear capability are the nuclear submarines, right? The Ohio class, especially. Well, okay. That is to say, the truth is, it needs modernization. While Russia has managed to modernize its entire nuclear capability, and China is simply building a new one, since it didn't have it before, the United States, logically, has a very outdated one. And that's an enormous investment, a colossal investment. And of course, this will certainly brighten the days of the military-industrial complex. But this is a heavy burden in a country that has $38 trillion in debt, and whose interest payments already exceed the entire defense budget, plus education, plus research and development. Mind you, the interest on the debt. The modernization of nuclear capability is going to cost an enormous amount of money and great sacrifice for Americans, who are the ones who will have to pay for it, unless they steal it from others out there. The issue is that, of course, Trump's message is absolutely inconsistent with the always Western claims of fighting for peace, the threat of Russia, and so on. The threat of Russia, Well, I'm the one who's going to conduct the nuclear tests. That's what Trump is saying.
Rusia, pero las pruebas nucleares las voy a hacer yo. Es lo que dice Trump. ¿Vale? Y voy a modernizar la teoría nuclear porque además somos la potencia nuclear más grande del mundo.
And I'm going to modernize nuclear technology because besides, we're the biggest nuclear power in the entire world. Okay? Very well. Well, what that actually does is provoke nuclear proliferation once again. Because whenever an adversary modernizes their nuclear arsenal, it forces other actors to pursue greater modernization too. No one can risk letting the other side gain a strategic advantage and feel tempted to launch a first nuclear strike. This has already happened. We saw it during the Cold War. So I'm not making this up. We've lived through it. We're remembering the Pershing missiles, all the uproar they caused in Europe back in the 1980s. Right? And before the fall of the Soviet Union, we can remind ourselves, we've already been through this, and we know where it leads. Then look, the Dark Eagle, for example, is a missile that can carry a nuclear payload, which the United States wants to deploy in Europe. Russia's reaction could be quite logical. You deploy a missile in Europe, and I'll deploy my Sarmat in Venezuela, or in Cuba, or in Nicaragua. We've lived through this before. This was the missile crisis of '62. We're going back to the same thing again, the same thing again. Then on the other hand, Trump says what we've heard, but he still hasn't responded to Russia's proposal to extend and renegotiate the START treaty, the Strategic Arms Limitation Agreement, which is set to expire next February. What is he thinking? He needs to think about it. Well, if he needs to think about it, then you're not heading toward any denuclearization or anything of the sort. You're simply in your usual mental confusion, acting on whatever nonsense is whispered in your ear by the fool wandering the halls of the White House. Most likely a globalist or a neocon ready to go to war because their religion tells them to, or because they only see the money they'll make from the commissions of the military-industrial complex. And that's it. This is who you are, Trump. Nothing more. You're very little, because in the end it's clear that you have very little power. And then there's also a certain fear factor of raising the stakes to see if that pushes Russia toward a bigger negotiation. And we can avoid what the Kremlin has already said, that new nuclear-propelled weapons are being developed. Something I think we already mentioned at some point. I don't know if it was on this show or another, because of course I'm starting to mix them up, right? We already mentioned that if, right now, the final tests, because they're already in production, of the Burevestnik, Poseidon, Avangard, and Sarmat, which were the weapons announced in addition to the Kinzhal back in 2018, are made public and evident, then possibly any day now, Putin will announce new weapons again. And the Western scribblers and reporters will say, no, this is artificial intelligence, Putin's bluster. Because that's what they said in 2018. That's what they said in 2018. They laughed. Now it's the rest of us laughing at the ridiculous spectacle they've made of themselves all along. Of course, they always rely on how short people's memories are, right? I mean, ordinary people. But if you look back at the archives, well, the laughter, the guffaws can be heard all the way up on Mount Olympus.
Las risas, las carcajadas se escuchan en el Monte Olimpo, del ridículo que hizo la prensa occidental.
The ridiculous spectacle the Western press made when they laughed at Putin's weapons. Now panic. Now, yes, panic. Nuclear-powered rockets that can fly for weeks at 50 or 100 meters of altitude, capable of dodging all radars because they detect the radar signal and avoid it. Because they have no fuel problem. The rocket, the missile. Why? Because it carries a nuclear reactor. Why? It has no fuel problem. And it also shows an impressive technological development. Managing to compact a nuclear reactor to a size that, for what it is tiny. Just look at what nuclear reactors are, not those of a nuclear power plant, those are huge, but the ones a nuclear submarine can carry. Compare a nuclear submarine with a conventional one.
Comparen un submarino nuclear con un submarino convencional. Verán la envergadura que tiene, porque tiene que llevar el reactor.
Look at the size it has, because it has to carry the reactor and its fuel. Look at a nuclear-powered ship, they're all huge. Well, the Russians have managed to compact those reactors to really turn them into micro-reactors that work in rockets and will have civilian applications, in icebreakers, in spacecraft. It's going to have civilian applications. This is a qualitative technological leap. And of course, that bothers some people. It bothers the master of the world, who sees that, well, they haven't managed to do it. The biggest, the prettiest, the smartest, the richest haven't managed to do it. And so, well, what do? In all of this, ultimately, what the United States and logically the American oligarchy does is start a headlong rush forward.
Lógicamente, la oligarquía norteamericana es iniciar una huida hacia adelante. Una huida hacia adelante. Nuevamente, ¿para qué?
A headlong rush forward. Again, for what purpose? Well, with the sole objective of really hiding what is a decline. Because technologically, after years and years, the Kinzhal hypersonic missile has already been in service with the Russian army for many years. There still isn't a missile in use by the US military that's hypersonic. Years have gone by. In the end, they'll get there for sure. They'll get there, but they're years behind. And in those races, when you take the lead, it's very hard to catch up. I don't want to say anything about the Chinese. I don't want to say anything about their technology, for example, in avionics, right? Here, the only sixth-generation aircraft we've seen fly is Chinese.
Aquí el único avión que hemos visto volar de sexta generación es chino. Es el único que hemos visto volar. Y todavía está en pruebas.
It's the only one we've seen fly, and it's still in testing. Production will start soon. And the United States is still now thinking about the design of what will be the successor to the F-35, the F-47. They're thinking about it now. So what are we talking about then? 8, 10, 12 years? By then, the Chinese will be on the 7th or 8th generation, probably with avionics already designed and managed by artificial intelligence. In other words, what these advantages show indeed is that, well, it's true that with a defense budget of over $1 trillion, the United States has the most powerful military in the world. However, in the end, it's not all about money, especially when a private military-industrial complex is primarily focused on developing very expensive weapon systems that yield high profits. Which means, it's not out of the question that in 1, 3, or 5 years, the military capacity of powers that have so far been secondary, like China or Russia, could end up surpassing that of the United States. And I think that's what we're seeing with all this big theater of, we're resuming nuclear tests, we need to move toward denuclearization, we're the strongest team in the world, and so on. The truth is, let's not fool ourselves. All armies test their missiles. India did it recently and Pakistan has tested its missiles. Not long ago, Iran tested a missile with a range of up to 10,000 kilometers, a ballistic missile. This isn't unusual. It's normal. Western countries do it too. The French also tested one of their missiles recently. In other words, this is normal, nothing special.
Here are Medvedev's words, which I find very accurate. Nobody knows what Trump meant by nuclear tests. Probably not even he knows. But he is the President of the United States, and the consequences of such words are inevitable. Russia will be forced to assess the advisability of conducting its own large-scale nuclear tests.
Exactly. Of course, this is the starting shot for a new arms race. And arms races, on paper, they can be quite interesting. In fact, someone might even say, and with some reason, well, in the end, some things also end up benefiting the civilian industry, right? But the thing is, weapon systems are very expensive, extremely expensive. And where's the money going to come from? Think about it. Where's the money going to come from? I'll tell you, from your wallet, from you. Because, in the end, weapons are bought by states with their budgets. And what are those budgets filled with? With your money. So you're the one who's going to pay for it. You're the one who's going to foot that bill.
va a pagar eso. Esa cadena perpetua va a pagar usted. Luego se van a beneficiar los de siempre. Pero el dinero lo van a poner usted.
Then the usual ones will benefit, but you'll be the ones paying for it. So of course, what can you say? Is there any reason to carry out nuclear tests? No. In fact, Russia would have no need to. But there's an issue of symmetry with respect to an opposing power. If you conduct nuclear tests, I'm going to conduct them too. Because otherwise I'd be giving you an advantage, a possible or potential advantage, that I logically cannot allow. Which means what you're starting is an arms race. And well, as I said, more cost that will end up where it always does, at the expense of other budget items that are more beneficial to the population. And finally, there's one thing to keep in mind.
Y finalmente hay que tener en cuenta una cosa. Las armas no crean valor.
Weapons don't create value. Weapons are an expense that you store, and if after 10 years, 8 years, 15 years, depending on the weapons system, you haven't used them, meaning you haven't needed them in a war, they become obsolete. Or you can resell them at a low price, or you have to dismantle them. In other words, an expense that what value has it generated? None. Weapons only generate value if they're used. And to use them, you have to wage war. Or the factory, to sell them, of course, because it's expecting others to wage war. In short, right? Weapons are an expense. They don't create value. They're just an expense. Does it have to be done? Well, yes. Defense policy. It's logical that all countries have their defense budgets and therefore develop weapons systems that guarantee that defense. But that's one thing. You're not going to think that I'm going to start an arms race that's not about rifles or better ammunition, but about nuclear missiles. And that's an unaffordable cost, especially right now in Europe, where there's no money for anything. There's no money for anything. And as if we in Europe were also going to start building up a nuclear deterrent force with an absolutely unbearable cost that we simply can't afford.
Bien, clarísima tu perspectiva, Juan Antonio. Por último, muy cortito.
All right, your perspective is very clear, Juan Antonio. Lastly, very briefly, maybe a quick recap of what happened in New York with the victory of Mayor Zoran Mamdani, according to his own description, Trump's worst nightmare, and of 2 Democratic governors in other states in the elections held last Sunday. How important is this geopolitically in relation to Trump, Juan Antonio, in your opinion?
Let's see. I mean, we can make a political reading here, but I imagine you'll surely discuss it in the coming days. Why the Republican Party lost, why Trump lost, why the Democratic Party won, and why this gentleman from New York won. In other words, there are political interpretations that it makes sense to consider. For my part, to give it a more geopolitical reading, I have to refer mainly to the fact that this is an expression, yet another proof, that the United States, in some way, continues to increase its structural risks. Let me explain.
Riesgos estructurales. Me explico. Sin ninguna duda, esto...
Without a doubt, this is yet another sign of the social divide that exists, where candidates on both sides, Republicans and Democrats, are also becoming more radicalized. In other words, to put it simply, Republicans are becoming more Republican and Democrats more Democratic, or one side more right-wing and the other more progressive. When I say progressive, no one should think we're talking about the working class left, and much less, as some portray this man Mamdani, as if he were a communist. He's a man from the Wall Street elite, from the New York elite, who have historically been Democrats, and that's all. If he's been paid by the Jewish community, Soros, Soros's networks, and others, they've financed his campaign. So no one should imagine that with this man, no matter how socialist he claims to be, New York City Hall is going to shift towards socialist-style social policies. It all has to do with what they understand as progressive in the United States, right? So he said that this will logically lead to greater polarization, greater fracture, greater ideological division. Because, for example, the Jewish vote in New York has been split. 43% voted for this man, even though some accuse him of being a Muslim, a jihadist, and practically a member of Hamas. 43% voted for this man.
Más, ¿eh? Es decir, 43% ha votado a este señor. La otra mitad, no. ¿Mm?
The other half, no. There's also polarization and a territorial and demographic divide between what we're seeing in the eastern and western states, the coastal ones, and what we're seeing in the central states of the United States. Something we've already been noticing in other elections. There's a clear division in the two-party system, where a large part of the population, about 43%, doesn't identify with either Republicans or Democrats and has nowhere to see their political views represented. And this also leads to disaffection, to a crisis, therefore, of legitimacy for the entire American system. And how does that show? In record abstention. That is to say, yes, there was higher turnout in New York in these elections.
Participación en Nueva York en estas elecciones. Ojo, estamos hablando de un 20% de participación.
Careful. We're talking about a 20% turnout. In Europe, that would be ridiculous. Honestly, a disaster. And on top of that, if we look at the economic indicators, both internal and external, the outlook isn't good for what's happening. In fact, if you put all that together, plus an economic crisis, plus a very bad economic situation, it's no surprise that some analysts are talking about the possibility of a civil war or civil conflict in the United States, right? To mention a few details about the economic data. Total federal debt, $38 trillion, the highest since 1946, or more than 100% of GDP. Annual interest on the debt, $1.1 trillion. The projection for the year 2050 is 200% of GDP. That's unsustainable, isn't it? But look, add even more data, right? For example, the United States would need to grow 3.2% annually to hold on for 30 years, to sustain this debt. Above inflation, 3.2% above inflation. What do economist studies project? 1.6%. How is that going to hold up? Bad news, huh? I don't know how they're going to pay for the modernization of nuclear capacity. But on top of that, if you add an aging population, stagnant productivity, rising unemployment, technological competition with China, and the fact that interest payments on the debt are leaving the United States.
Se están yendo fuera de Estados Unidos. El 75% de ese pago, de ese
75% of those 1.1 trillion in interest that must be paid every year goes to China and other holders of U.S. debt. In other words, the country is being decapitalized, little by little, drop by drop, just like the de-dollarization process. We already know that gold reserves in central banks have, for the first time since 1996, surpassed reserves in U.S. Treasury bonds. Or, for example, how debt in some countries is shifting from dollars to yuan, especially in African nations, or how BRICS countries are setting up alternative payment systems to the SWIFT system. Of course, all of this gradually weakens U.S. hegemony. And I think what we're seeing with these elections, and we'll see it again in the midterms and of course in the next presidential ones, is a kind of change so that nothing changes strategy. It's meant to look like everything is shifting, but everything stays the same. Because this man, after all, the mayor of New York, what is he? He's nothing more than a symbolic figure. He's an Obama 2.0, a bargain bin Obama. He presents himself again as some kind of leftist, which he isn't, serving fundamentally neoliberal ideas with a touch of charity, like freezing rents, free transportation, and things like that, which in the end just means increasing public spending and increasing debt, because where's the money supposed to come from? From Wall Street's financial speculation? From Jewish fortunes because they're the ones who control the real estate market in New York? No, that's not where the money will come from, I can tell you that. A program, therefore, very difficult to implement. It will be a failure that they'll try to justify in some other way. And well, it only deepens those fractures that, have happened to all empires. There comes a time when their decline reaches such a downward slope that it becomes impossible to stop.
Ya toma un ángulo de caída que ya hace imposible que se pueda parar.
Bien, querido Juan Antonio, vamos a redondear la...
All right, dear Juan Antonio, let's wrap up the talk here. We'll present the European issue another time. Better that way. Don't mess with me. And better, right? Also, honestly, I'm really tired after the trip, and a well-deserved rest. To all our tireless folks, it's Friday, so in a little while, in half an hour, Fernando Moragon starts with his show, and then we'll continue with our usual programming, as always. Beatriz Pulido, our moderator, as always, 1,000 thanks. And dear Juan Antonio, a big hug, and see you next time.
Un abrazo enorme y hasta la próxima.
Until next time, and greetings to everyone.